The December wind cut through Millbrook's empty streets like a blade. Connor Walsh sat motionless in his battered pickup, engine ticking as it cooled from another grueling security shift. Christmas Eve had surrendered to the witching hour, leaving behind only the ghost glow of holiday lights and the weight of his exhaustion. Then he saw her. A wisp of a child, no more than 8, hunched over garbage bins like a broken bird. Her blonde hair clung to gaunt cheeks in frozen strands. The oversized coat swallowed her fragile frame, sleeves dangling past trembling fingertips. She moved with the desperate precision of someone who had done this before. Digging, searching, praying. When she finally found what she sought, she pressed it against her heart and crumpled into the snow, her silent tears crystallizing in the bitter air. Connor's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. What could drive a child to scavenge on the holiest night of the year? The answer would change everything he believed about second chances. Connor killed the engine. His work boots crunched against the frozen pavement as he approached the small figure. The child's shoulders shook with silent sobs, her face buried in whatever treasure she'd salvaged from the refuse. Up close, he could see the dirt smudged across her hollow cheeks, the way her thin fingers clutched desperately at her prize. She couldn't weigh more than 60 pounds soaking wet. The smell of garbage mixed with the sharp bite of winter air, creating a cocktail of desperation that made his stomach turn. "Hey there." Connor's voice came out gentler than he'd intended. "You okay, sweetheart?" The little girl's head snapped up, revealing eyes the color of storm clouds. Fear flickered across her features like lightning. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the cold brick wall behind the dumpster. Her breath came in short puffs of white vapor, and Connor noticed how her lips had taken on a bluish tint from the cold. The object in her arms appeared to be some kind of doll, its matted hair and torn dress speaking of years of love and neglect. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. Connor raised his hand slowly, the way he'd learned to approach wounded animals. His own daughter Mia was only 6, but he recognized the look of a child who'd learned to expect the worst from adults. The comparison made his chest tight. 3 years since Sarah's death, and he still felt like he was fumbling through fatherhood with one hand tied behind his back. But this wasn't about his failures. This was about a little girl alone in the cold on Christmas Eve. "I know you're not, honey. I'm just worried about you being out here so late." Connor took a careful step closer, noting how she flinched at his movement. Her clothes were too big, hanging off her small frame like hand-me-downs from an older child. The coat had seen better days, its synthetic filling visible through several small tears. "What's your name?" She studied his face with an intensity that seemed far too mature for her age. Her gaze lingered on his worn flannel shirt, his calloused hands, the exhaustion etched around his eyes. Something in his appearance must have reassured her, because her grip on the doll loosened slightly. "Ruby," she said finally. The name hung in the frigid air between them like a prayer. Connor nodded, committing it to memory. This wasn't a chance encounter he'd forget by morning. Something about this child, about this moment, felt like destiny knocking on his door. He'd learned to trust those instincts over the years, especially since losing Sarah. Life had a way of putting people in your path when you least expected it and most needed it. "That's a pretty name. I'm Connor." He gestured toward the doll in her arms. "And who's your friend there?" Ruby's eyes dropped to the toy, and her expression softened for the first time since he'd approached. She held it up slightly, revealing a blonde baby doll with one missing leg and a dress that might have once been pink. The doll's face was stained with something that could have been dirt or tears, and its hair had been chopped short and uneven, as if by a child's unpracticed hand. "This is Dolly. She got lost." Ruby's voice grew stronger as she spoke about her companion. "Someone threw her away, but she doesn't belong in the trash. She belongs with me." The way she said it, with such fierce conviction, made Connor's throat tighten. He'd heard that same tone from Mia when defending her own treasured possessions. It was the sound of a child's absolute truth, uncomplicated by adult reasoning or social expectations. In Ruby's world, love was enough to rescue anything from abandonment. Connor glanced around the empty street, taking in the warm glow emanating from nearby houses. Somewhere behind those lit windows, families were finishing their Christmas Eve traditions. Children were being tucked into beds with stories of Santa and magic, while parents crept around placing presents under decorated trees. The contrast with this moment, with this child scavenging alone in the cold, struck him as profoundly wrong. No child should know such loneliness on a night meant for wonder and joy. "Ruby, where do you live? Are your parents looking for you?" The questions felt necessary, though he suspected the answers wouldn't be simple. Ruby's expression shuttered again, that guardedness returning like a wall sliding into place. She clutched Dolly tighter, as if the doll could protect her from difficult truths. When she spoke, her words came slowly, carefully chosen. She was clearly a child who'd learned that the wrong answer could lead to consequences she didn't want to face. "I live with Mrs. Hartwell. She takes care of me." The way Ruby said "takes care of" made it sound more like a business arrangement than a family relationship. Connor filed that observation away for later consideration. "She doesn't know I'm gone. She's sleeping." There was something in her tone that suggested this wasn't the first time Ruby had slipped out of the house unnoticed. The practiced way she'd navigated the garbage bins, the careful timing of her excursion, all pointed to a child who'd learned to survive on her own resourcefulness. The wind picked up, sending a plastic bag skittering across the empty street like a lost ghost. Ruby shivered, and Connor noticed she wasn't wearing gloves. Her small hands were red from the cold, and he could see her teeth starting to chatter. Decision time. He couldn't leave her out here, but he also couldn't assume the right to make choices for someone else's child. The situation required delicacy, patience, and wisdom he wasn't sure he possessed. But sometimes being a father meant acting on instinct rather than certainty. "Ruby, it's Christmas Eve. Santa can't find you if you're not in your bed." He tried for a light tone, though his heart was heavy with concern. "How about I give you a ride home? We can get you warmed up in my truck." Ruby's eyes darted to his pickup, then back to his face. She was calculating risks, weighing options with the survival instincts of someone far older than her years. The fact that a child so young had developed such defensive mechanisms spoke to experiences Connor didn't want to imagine. "You won't tell Mrs. Hartwell I was out here?" The question revealed so much about Ruby's life. A child who felt she needed to hide her actions from her caregiver, who'd rather risk freezing than face whatever consequences awaited her at home. Connor's protective instincts, already heightened by 3 years of single fatherhood, kicked into overdrive. Every parental alarm bell in his head was ringing, but he forced himself to remain calm and reassuring. Pushing too hard now could send this fragile child running into the night. "That's between you and me, sweetheart." He meant it. Whatever was happening in Ruby's home life, she clearly felt safer on the streets than dealing with her guardian's reaction to her absence. That alone told him everything he needed to know about Mrs. Hartwell's approach to childcare. Connor had learned to trust his gut about people, and his gut was telling him this little girl was in trouble that went far beyond a midnight adventure in the garbage bins. Ruby considered his promise for a long moment, her breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. Finally, she nodded and pushed herself away from the brick wall. Her movements were stiff from the cold, and she stumbled slightly as she tried to walk. Connor instinctively reached out to steady her, noting how she didn't pull away from his touch. That small sign of trust felt like a victory. As they walked toward his truck, he found himself wondering how many children were spending Christmas Eve the way Ruby had. The thought was too depressing to dwell on. The pickup's interior was still warm from his drive home, and Ruby visibly relaxed as the heat enveloped her small frame. She cradled Dolly in her lap, smoothing the doll's tangled hair with gentle fingers. Connor adjusted the rear-view mirror so he could watch her while he drove, concerned about her pale complexion and the way she kept shivering despite the warmth. In the dashboard lights, she looked even younger and more vulnerable than she had outside. Her face held the kind of weariness that should never belong to a child. "Which way to Mrs. Hartwell's house?" Connor asked, though part of him dreaded delivering Ruby back to whatever situation had driven her out into the night. Ruby pointed toward the older section of town, where large Victorian houses had been divided into apartments and boarding situations. It was the kind of neighborhood where people minded their own business, where a child's cries might go unnoticed or unreported. Connor had driven through those streets many times, but tonight they seemed to take on a more sinister cast. The house Ruby indicated was a massive, 3-story Victorian that had seen better days. Paint peeled from its wooden siding, and several shutters hung askew. The front porch sagged under the weight of accumulated snow, and not a single Christmas decoration adorned the property. It stood in stark contrast to the neighboring homes, which blazed with holiday cheer. Even in the darkness, Connor could sense the building's air of neglect and indifference. This was not a place where childhood flourished or dreams took root. Ruby's small hand reached for the door handle, but she paused before opening it. "Thank you for helping me find Dolly," she said softly, "and for not being mad about the garbage." The simplicity of her gratitude broke something inside Connor's chest. That this child felt the need to thank someone for basic kindness spoke volumes about what she'd come to expect from the adults in her life. He wanted to say something profound, something that would matter to her in the days ahead. But words seemed inadequate for the moment. "Ruby, if you ever need help, you can find me. I work security at the industrial complex on Pine Street." He pulled a business card from his wallet, one with the security company's 24-hour number printed on it. "Someone there can always reach me?" Ruby took the card with the solemnity of someone receiving a sacred trust. She tucked it carefully into her coat pocket, right next to her heart. For a moment, neither of them moved. The truck's heater hummed softly, creating a cocoon of warmth in the cold December night. Then Ruby slipped out of the truck and disappeared into the shadows beside the Victorian house. Connor waited until he saw a light flicker on in an upstairs window before driving away. The image of her small form clutching that damaged doll stayed with him long after he'd reached his own modest home. As he sat in his driveway, staring at the simple Christmas wreath Mia had insisted they hang on the front door, Connor found himself thinking about the randomness of suffering. How some children got warm beds and Christmas stories, while others searched through garbage for broken toys. Inside his house, everything was quiet. Mia slept soundly in her room, surrounded by the stuffed animals and picture books that marked a childhood filled with love and security. Connor stood in her doorway for a moment, watching the rise and fall of her small chest, feeling grateful for what they had, even as his heart ached for what Ruby lacked. The contrast between the two girls' lives was stark and troubling. One safe and loved, the other surviving on scraps of hope and the companionship of a damaged doll. Sleep eluded Connor that night. He found himself staring at the ceiling, thinking about Ruby's storm-grey eyes and the careful way she'd spoken about Mrs. Hartwell. Something about the situation didn't sit right with him, but he couldn't put his finger on exactly what. Foster care, group homes, and guardian arrangements were complicated systems that he didn't fully understand. But he understood children, and Ruby had all the markers of a child who'd learned to expect disappointment from the adults entrusted with her care. Christmas morning dawned bright and clear, with fresh snow covering Millbrook's streets like a clean slate. Mia bounced into Connor's room at dawn, eyes bright with Christmas excitement. "Daddy, did Santa come? Can we open presents now?" Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Connor found himself smiling despite his lingering concerns about Ruby. This was Mia's day, and he was determined to make it magical for her. They had their own traditions to honor, their own small family celebrations to protect and cherish. But even as he watched Mia tear through wrapping paper with 6-year-old abandon, Connor's thoughts kept drifting to a little girl who might be spending Christmas morning with nothing more than a rescued doll for company. The image haunted him as he made pancakes and listened to Mia's chatter about her new books and art supplies. How many children in Millbrook were facing this holiday without the warmth and love that every child deserved? The question felt like a weight on his shoulders, a responsibility he couldn't quite define or dismiss. That afternoon, while Mia played with her new toys, Connor found himself driving past the Victorian house where he'd dropped Ruby off. The building looked even more forbidding in daylight, its broken gutters and cracked foundation visible in the harsh winter sun. No children played in the yard, no Christmas sounds emerged from the windows. The house seemed to swallow joy and spit out indifference. Connor parked across the street and waited, hoping to catch a glimpse of Ruby, to reassure himself that she was safe and cared for. An hour passed before the front door opened. A woman emerged, tall and angular, with steel-grey hair pulled into a severe bun. She walked with the rigid posture of someone who'd never learned to bend, and her expression was as welcoming as a winter storm. This had to be Mrs. Hartwell. Behind her trailed 3 children of varying ages, all dressed in identical navy coats that looked like institutional uniforms. They moved with the subdued quality of children who'd learned not to draw attention to themselves. Ruby was among them, nearly invisible in the group's careful anonymity. Connor watched as Mrs. Hartwell herded the children into an old sedan, their movements efficient but devoid of warmth. No one spoke during the loading process. No one smiled or showed excitement about their Christmas Day outing. They could have been prisoners being transported, for all the joy visible in their interaction. The sight made Connor's stomach turn. These weren't children being raised with love. They were being managed with cold efficiency. Ruby caught his eye for just a moment before the car door closed, and the look she gave him was both grateful and desperately hopeful. As the sedan pulled away from the curb, Connor made a decision that would change his life forever. He was going to learn everything he could about Mrs. Hartwell and her foster care arrangement. Ruby deserved better than whatever situations had driven her out into the cold on Christmas Eve. Every child deserved better than the sterile, joyless existence he'd just witnessed. Connor might not have the power to save all of them, but maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference for one little girl who'd stolen his heart with her fierce love for a broken doll. The next few days blurred together in a haze of research and growing concern. Connor used his lunch breaks to visit the library, learning about Connecticut's foster care system and the regulations governing group homes. What he discovered made his blood run cold. While most foster families provided loving homes for children in need, others saw the system as a business opportunity. The monthly stipends provided by the state could add up to significant income, especially if the children's actual needs were minimized or ignored entirely. Pete Morrison, who ran the hardware store where Connor picked up odd jobs, turned out to be a wealth of local information. Over coffee at Murphy's Diner, Pete filled in the details about Mrs. Hartwell's operation. "She's been taking in foster kids for about 15 years now," Pete said, stirring sugar into his coffee with the methodical precision of someone who'd perfected the ritual over decades. "Always has 4 or 5 at a time. State pays her pretty well for each one, but I've never seen those kids look happy. They're always so quiet, so careful, like they're afraid to breathe wrong." The picture Pete painted matched Connor's observations perfectly. Mrs. Hartwell ran her household like a military facility, prioritizing order and efficiency over emotional nurturing. The children under her care received adequate food, shelter, and clothing, but little in the way of affection or individual attention. It was technically legal, but it struck Connor as a profound betrayal of childhood itself. These were vulnerable kids who'd already lost so much, and instead of healing, they were being systematically taught that love was a luxury they couldn't expect or deserve. Connor's investigation revealed that Mrs. Hartwell had an impeccable record with the state's Department of Children and Families. Her home passed all inspections, her paperwork was always in order, and none of the children had ever filed formal complaints. But Connor was learning that compliance with regulations and actual care for children were two very different things. Ruby and the others were caught in a system that measured success by the absence of obvious problems rather than the presence of genuine nurturing and love. The knowledge ate at Connor as he went through his daily routines. Every time he tucked Mia into bed or listened to her excited chatter about school, he thought about Ruby sleeping in that cold Victorian house with only a damaged doll for comfort. The injustice of it gnawed at him, making it hard to concentrate on work or enjoy simple pleasures. He'd stumbled upon a situation that demanded action, but the question was what kind of action he could realistically take. Challenging the foster care system seemed like battling a mountain with a teaspoon. 2 weeks after Christmas, Connor made his decision. He was going to try to become Ruby's foster father. The process would be complicated and expensive, requiring home studies, background checks, and months of paperwork. There was no guarantee he'd be approved, and even if he was, there was no certainty that Ruby would be removed from Mrs. Hartwell's care without evidence of actual abuse or neglect. But he had to try. The alternative was accepting that a little girl he'd come to care about would continue living in emotional poverty while he did nothing to help her. The first step was contacting the Department of Children and Families. Connor spent his lunch break on the phone with a social worker named Jennifer Santos, who explained the foster care application process with professional warmth. "It's wonderful that you want to help a child," she said, "but I have to warn you that it's not a simple process. Becoming an approved foster parent typically takes 6 to 8 months, and that's if everything goes smoothly. There are training classes, home inspections, financial reviews, and psychological evaluations. Are you prepared for that level of commitment?" Connor thought about Ruby's face in the truck that night, the way she'd cradled her broken doll like it was the most precious thing in the world. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I'm prepared." Jennifer scheduled his initial appointment for the following week, and Connor spent the intervening days researching everything he could about successful foster care applications. The requirements were daunting, but not impossible. His biggest challenges would be his single-parent status and his modest income from security work. But he had a stable home, a clean record, and references who could vouch for his character and parenting abilities. The home study appointment went better than Connor had dared hope. Jennifer Santos turned out to be a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and an obvious passion for child welfare. She spent 3 hours touring Connor's modest house, interviewing him about his motivations and parenting philosophy, and playing with Mia to assess their family dynamic. "You have a lovely home," she said, as they concluded the visit. "Mia is clearly thriving, and it's obvious that you're a devoted father. But I have to ask why you specifically want to foster Ruby Harrison. Usually we match children with families rather than the other way around." Connor had prepared for this question, knowing it was crucial to his application's success. "I encountered Ruby in a situation where she needed help," he said carefully, not wanting to reveal details that might get the child in trouble. "She's been on my mind ever since. I know that fostering isn't about saving individual children, but sometimes connections happen that feel important. Ruby and I connected that night, and I believe I could provide her with the stable, loving home she deserves." Jennifer made notes in her file, her expression unreadable. The process would take months to complete, but this first step felt like progress. Spring arrived in Millbrook with the gradual warmth that made everyone remember why they lived in New England. Connor's foster care application moved through the bureaucratic pipeline with agonizing slowness. He completed the required training classes, submitted to background checks and financial reviews, and endured psychological evaluations that probed every aspect of his personality and motivations. Meanwhile, he maintained his security job and tried to be the best father possible to Mia, who had adjusted to the idea of potentially having a sister with the adaptability that made children so remarkable. In April, Connor received notification that his foster care application had been approved. The letter from the Department of Children and Families was brief and official, but to Connor it represented months of hope and determination finally bearing fruit. He was now qualified to provide foster care for one child aged 5 to 10, pending placement availability and case-specific considerations. All that remained was the delicate process of requesting Ruby's reassignment from Mrs. Hartwell's care to his own. This would require documented reasons for the transfer and Ruby's consent to the arrangement. The social worker assigned to Ruby's case was a young man named David Chen, who seemed genuinely concerned about the children under his supervision. When Connor contacted him about his interest in fostering Ruby, David's initial response was cautious but not dismissive. "I've been monitoring Ruby's placement with Mrs. Hartwell," he said during their phone conversation. "Everything appears to be in order from a regulatory standpoint, but I've had some concerns about the emotional environment in that home. If you're seriously interested in providing foster care for Ruby, I'd need to conduct interviews with both of you to assess whether a placement change would be in her best interests." The process of arranging those interviews proved more complex than Connor had anticipated. Mrs. Hartwell was not pleased to learn that one of her children might be reassigned to another foster family, especially when that reassignment would reduce her monthly income from the state. She made her displeasure known during a heated phone conversation with David Chen, demanding to know what complaints had been filed against her care. "I provide excellent homes for these children," she insisted, her voice carrying the righteous indignation of someone whose authority had been questioned. "They're fed, clothed, housed, and educated. What more could they possibly need?" David's response was diplomatic but firm. "Mrs. Hartwell, no one is questioning your compliance with state regulations. However, when a qualified foster family expresses interest in caring for a specific child, we have an obligation to explore whether that placement might better serve the child's overall well-being. This is standard procedure, and I hope you'll cooperate with the assessment process." Mrs. Hartwell's reluctant agreement came with conditions and complaints, but it came nonetheless. The wheels were finally in motion for Ruby to potentially join Connor's family. The interview with Ruby took place at the Department of Children and Families office on a rainy Thursday afternoon in May. Connor arrived early, nervous about seeing the little girl who had haunted his thoughts for nearly 5 months. When Ruby entered the conference room with David Chen, Connor's heart nearly broke. She looked thinner than he remembered, and there was a wariness in her storm-grey eyes that hadn't been there on Christmas Eve. She was still clutching Dolly, though the doll's condition had deteriorated further since their first meeting. "Hello, Ruby," Connor said gently, remaining seated so as not to appear intimidating. "Do you remember me?" Ruby's face brightened slightly, and she nodded. "You helped me find Dolly. You said I could call you if I needed help." Her voice was soft but clear, and Connor felt a surge of hope that she remembered him positively. David Chen took notes as they talked, occasionally asking questions to assess Ruby's feelings about her current placement and her potential interest in living with Connor's family. "Ruby, how do you feel about living with Mrs. Hartwell?" David asked. The question made Ruby's expression become guarded again. She glanced between the two adults as if calculating which answer would get her in the least trouble. Connor recognized that careful consideration from their first meeting, and it broke his heart to see it again. No child should have to strategize their responses to questions about their own well-being and happiness. The fact that Ruby felt the need to do so spoke volumes about her living situation. "She takes good care of me," Ruby said finally, the words sounding rehearsed. "I have food and clothes and a bed to sleep in." It was technically true, but notably lacking in warmth or genuine affection. David made more notes, clearly hearing the same emotional distance in Ruby's response that Connor detected. They spent another hour discussing practical matters like school, friends, and daily routines, building a picture of Ruby's life that was adequate but joyless. When David asked Ruby how she felt about the possibility of living with Connor and Mia, her whole demeanor changed. For the first time during the interview, genuine excitement flickered in her eyes. "Would I really get to live with you?" she asked Connor directly, abandoning the careful formality she'd maintained throughout the meeting. "Would Mia want to be my sister?" The hope in her voice was almost too much to bear. Connor found himself blinking back tears as he assured her that both he and Mia were very much looking forward to the possibility of her joining their family. The final decision would take several more weeks, as David conducted additional interviews and compiled his recommendation for the Placement Review Committee. Connor used that time to prepare his house for Ruby's arrival, converting his home office into a bedroom and filling it with furniture and decorations appropriate for a 9-year-old girl. Mia helped enthusiastically, picking out bedding with stars and moons and insisting that Ruby would need plenty of books and art supplies. "She's going to be the best sister ever," Mia declared with 6-year-old certainty, and Connor found himself hoping desperately that she'd get the chance to prove it. On a sunny morning in early June, Connor received the phone call he'd been waiting for. David Chen's voice was warm with satisfaction as he delivered the news. "The Placement Review Committee has approved Ruby's transfer to your foster care, effective immediately. Mrs. Hartwell has been notified, and she's agreed to have Ruby's belongings ready for pickup this afternoon. Congratulations, Connor. I think you're going to make a wonderful difference in that little girl's life." Connor thanked David through a throat tight with emotion, then immediately called his supervisor to request the afternoon off. Today was the day Ruby came home. Mrs. Hartwell's reception of Connor was as cold as he'd expected, but she was professionally courteous in the presence of David Chen. Ruby's belongings fit into a single grocery bag, a pitiful collection that spoke to the temporary nature of her life under Mrs. Hartwell's care. Most heartbreaking was the careful way Ruby carried Dolly, as if the damaged toy was her most precious possession. Which Connor realized it probably was. In a life marked by instability and emotional poverty, that broken doll represented continuity and unconditional love. The drive to Connor's house was quiet, with Ruby staring out the window at neighborhoods she'd never seen before. Connor found himself pointing out landmarks and explaining details about their community, trying to help her understand that this wasn't just another temporary placement. "That's Murphy's Diner," he said as they passed the familiar restaurant. "They make the best pancakes in town. We'll have to take you there for breakfast sometime." Ruby nodded solemnly, as if filing away important information about her new world. Mia was waiting on the front porch when they pulled into the driveway, bouncing with excitement that was impossible to contain. "Ruby! Ruby! Come see your room. I helped Daddy make it perfect for you." Her enthusiasm was infectious, and for the first time since entering the car, Ruby smiled genuinely. Connor watched as his daughter took Ruby's free hand and pulled her toward the house, chattering about all the things they were going to do together. It was exactly the welcome Ruby deserved, full of warmth and acceptance and joy. Ruby's first night in Connor's house was marked by small revelations. She was amazed by the idea that she could take a bath whenever she wanted, that the refrigerator contained food she was allowed to eat without asking permission, and that Connor genuinely wanted to hear about her day and her thoughts. "Is this really my bed?" she asked as Connor tucked her in, her voice filled with wonder at the concept of ownership. "Just mine." Connor assured her that everything in the room was hers to keep, watching as she carefully arranged Dolly on the pillow beside her. Some children took such basic security for granted, but Ruby understood its value in ways that broke Connor's heart and filled him with determination to heal whatever damage had been done. The first few weeks were an adjustment for everyone. Ruby had to learn that she was allowed to express preferences about food, activities, and daily routines. Mia had to adjust to sharing her father's attention with another child, though she embraced her big sister role with enthusiasm that surprised Connor. and Connor had to navigate the complexities of caring for a child who'd been taught to expect disappointment and abandonment. Ruby's reflexive gratitude for every kindness revealed how little genuine care she'd received in her young life. Simple acts like helping her with homework or listening to her read became profound gestures in a world where adults had previously been distant figures of authority rather than sources of nurturing and support. School presented its own challenges. Ruby was academically behind her peers, not due to any lack of intelligence, but because she'd never received the individual attention that helps children thrive educationally. Connor spent his evenings working with her on reading and math, celebrating every small victory with the enthusiasm usually reserved for major achievements. "I got all my spelling words right," Ruby announced one afternoon, her face glowing with pride. Connor hugged her tightly, understanding that this success represented not just academic progress, but growing confidence in her own abilities and worth. The transformation in Ruby over the summer was remarkable. The pale, fearful child Connor had found searching through garbage bins gradually emerged as a bright, curious girl with a gift for art and an infectious laugh. She and Mia became inseparable, creating elaborate imaginary games and sharing secrets in the way that sisters do. Connor often found them curled up together on the living room couch, reading books or working on craft projects. Dolly always nearby as a silent witness to Ruby's new happiness and security. One evening in late August, as Connor was putting both girls to bed, Ruby asked him a question that he'd been expecting but dreading. "Connor, am I going to stay here forever? Or will I have to leave when I get older?" The vulnerability in her voice reminded him of that Christmas Eve night when she'd clutched her broken doll in the snow. Connor sat down on the edge of her bed, choosing his words carefully. The truth was that foster care arrangements could change for any number of reasons, but Ruby deserved more certainty than the system typically provided. "Ruby, I want you to stay here forever. You're part of our family now, and families don't give up on each other." He paused, then continued with a gentleness that came from the depths of his heart. "In fact, I've been talking to my lawyer about adopting you officially. That would make you my daughter legally, not just in my heart. Would you like that?" Ruby's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. She nodded vigorously, then threw her arms around Connor's neck in a hug that conveyed everything words couldn't express. The adoption process would take several more months to complete, but Connor had never been more certain of any decision in his life. Ruby had transformed their small family in ways he was still discovering. She'd taught Mia about resilience and gratitude, shown Connor that his capacity for love was larger than he'd imagined, and proven that broken things could be made beautiful again with enough patience and care. Just like her beloved Dolly, Ruby had been discarded and damaged, but in the right hands, she'd revealed the treasure she'd always been inside. Christmas Eve arrived again, marking nearly a year since Connor first encountered Ruby, searching through those garbage bins. This time, Ruby was safely asleep in her own bed, surrounded by the books and toys and artwork that marked a childhood finally free to unfold naturally. Connor stood in her doorway, watching the rise and fall of her breathing, Dolly tucked safely beside her. The doll had been carefully repaired over the months, its torn dress mended and its missing leg replaced, just as Ruby herself had been healed through consistent love and care. The adoption papers were scheduled to be finalized in January, making Ruby officially Ruby Harrison Walsh. She'd chosen to keep Harrison as her middle name, honoring the surname she'd carried through her years in foster care, while embracing Walsh as her permanent family identity. Connor couldn't imagine a more perfect Christmas gift than the knowledge that Ruby would never again spend a holiday night searching through garbage for scraps of love and belonging. She had found her forever home, and in doing so, she had completed a family that Connor hadn't even realized was incomplete. As he turned off Ruby's bedroom light and headed toward his own room, Connor reflected on the mysterious ways that life brings people together. A chance encounter on Christmas Eve had led to a love story that none of them could have anticipated. Ruby had been searching for a discarded doll, but she'd found a father. Connor had been trying to help a lost child, but he'd discovered that she was the daughter his heart had been missing. Sometimes the most important things in life come disguised as accidents or coincidences, but Connor now understood that there had been nothing accidental about finding Ruby that snowy December night. It had been destiny, pure and simple, waiting for exactly the right moment to reveal itself to a man ready to love and a child desperate to be loved in return.